It was the kind of morning that carried more silence than sound, the sky pale and restrained above the capital, where power lived behind tall stone walls. Duke Adrian Valmont stood at the window of his estate, watching the city stir with distant indifference, as if nothing in the world could reach him unless he allowed it. At 25, he had already learned to distrust anything that asked for his heart, and he had perfected the art of keeping it locked away. The summons for marriage had not surprised him, only irritated him, because it threatened the control he had built so carefully. Across the city, Mary sat in a modest drawing room, her hands folded neatly in her lap while her father spoke in hushed urgency. At 23, she understood far more than she ever revealed, and though her family's circumstances had grown fragile, she refused to let fear define her. The proposal placed before her was simple in wording yet heavy in consequence. A contract marriage to the Duke of Valmont, an arrangement designed to serve stability rather than affection. Mary listened without interruption, her expression calm, her thoughts steady, as she weighed not what she wanted but what was necessary. When she finally spoke, her voice carried neither hesitation nor resentment, only quiet resolve, and she agreed to the terms with a composure that unsettled even her father. Their first meeting took place in a formal chamber where every detail seemed designed to remind them of distance. Adrian observed her with sharp precision, expecting ambition, desperation, or calculation, yet finding none of those things. Mary met his gaze without challenge or submission, as if she had already accepted the nature of what stood between them. He broke the silence first, his tone measured and cold, making no attempt to soften the truth. "It's only a contract marriage, nothing else," he said, as though the words were a shield rather than a warning. Mary inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the boundary without protest, and in that small gesture, he sensed something he could not immediately name. The wedding followed with minimal ceremony, attended by those who valued appearances more than meaning. There were no whispered promises, no lingering glances, only a formal exchange that bound two lives under a single agreement. Mary entered the Valmont estate not as a bride in love, but as a woman who understood her role, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that neither demanded attention nor avoided it. Adrian maintained his distance, ensuring that every arrangement within the household reflected the terms they had agreed upon. Separate rooms were prepared, schedules were kept precise, and interactions remained strictly necessary. Yet within days, subtle changes began to unfold, not in grand gestures, but in small details that resisted being ignored. Mary spoke to the servants with a kindness that felt natural rather than performative, learning their names and listening when they answered. She adjusted routines gently, bringing order without disruption, and though she never overstepped, the atmosphere of the estate began to shift in ways Adrian could not easily dismiss. He noticed it in passing, at first with mild curiosity, then with a growing awareness that something unfamiliar was taking root within the walls he had always kept emotionally barren. Mary, however, asked for nothing in return. She did not seek his approval, nor did she attempt to draw closer than the contract allowed. Her presence was steady, her silence unforced, and her restraint seemed less like obedience and more like choice. This, more than anything else, unsettled him. One evening, as the fading light settled across the estate, Adrian encountered her in the corridor, standing beside an open window where the air moved freely. For a brief moment, neither spoke, yet the quiet between them felt different from before, not empty but undefined. He realized then that she had not once tried to change him, and that absence of pressure made her far more difficult to understand than any expectation ever could. Mary turned slightly, offering a polite acknowledgement before continuing on her way, leaving him with a faint sense that something important had just passed unnoticed. He dismissed the feeling quickly, retreating once more into the certainty of the agreement, reminding himself that nothing about this arrangement was meant to matter. Yet as the night deepened, the quiet of the estate carried a subtle difference, one that lingered just beyond his control, and though he refused to name it, He could not entirely ignore the possibility that the contract he relied upon might not remain as simple as he intended. The days within the Valmont estate began to settle into a rhythm that, while outwardly unchanged, carried an undercurrent neither Adrian nor Mary acknowledged. What had started as a strictly defined arrangement gradually developed into something less rigid, though no words were spoken to redefine it. Adrian continued to conduct his affairs with the same precision, attending council meetings, reviewing estate matters, and maintaining the reputation expected of him. Yet his awareness of Mary's presence sharpened in ways he had not anticipated. Mary moved through the estate with quiet purpose, never intrusive, yet impossible to overlook. She did not attempt to occupy his time, nor did she withdraw excessively, instead existing in a careful balance that respected the boundaries he had drawn. The servants responded to her with genuine warmth, not out of obligation, but because she treated them with consistent consideration, and this change subtly altered the tone of the household. Conversations became lighter, the corridors less oppressive, and even the rigid routines seemed to carry a sense of ease. Adrian noticed these shifts with increasing clarity, though he resisted assigning them significance. He told himself that efficiency had improved, that the estate simply functioned better under Mary's quiet influence. Yet this explanation failed to account for the moments that lingered beyond logic. There were instances when he would hear her voice in distant conversation, calm and reassuring, and find himself pausing without reason. There were evenings when he returned later than expected, only to see a lamp still lit in a sitting room she occupied, and feel an unfamiliar awareness settle within him. One such evening, he entered to find her seated with a ledger open before her, reviewing accounts with careful attention. She looked up as he approached, her expression composed yet attentive, as if she had been expecting neither interruption nor acknowledgement. Without hesitation, she informed him of minor discrepancies she had noticed, presenting solutions with clarity and restraint. Adrian listened, initially with polite detachment, but soon with genuine interest as he realized her observations were both precise and insightful. "You've reviewed the estate records thoroughly," he remarked, his tone neutral but edged with curiosity. "I thought it might be helpful," Mary replied simply, offering no further explanation, as though her contribution required no recognition. He studied her briefly, searching for any indication of ulterior motive, yet finding none. She did not seek praise, nor did she attempt to impress him, and this absence of expectation unsettled him more than any calculated effort could have. He accepted her suggestions with a nod, dismissing the conversation outwardly, though inwardly he found himself reconsidering his assumptions about her. As the weeks passed, such interactions became more frequent, each one small in isolation, yet significant in accumulation. Mary's presence extended beyond the visible order of the estate into something less tangible, something that began to influence Adrian's thoughts despite his efforts to remain unaffected. He found himself noticing details he would have once ignored, the way she listened fully when spoken to, the steadiness of her gaze, the absence of pretense in her actions. At a formal gathering hosted within the estate, members of the aristocracy observed Mary with interest, expecting either ambition or insecurity from a woman in her position. Instead, they encountered composure, intelligence, and a quiet confidence that required no display. She engaged in conversation with ease, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it, and her presence gradually commanded respect without effort. Adrian watched from a distance, initially out of obligation, then with a focus he did not fully understand. When one guest spoke too freely, testing boundaries with veiled condescension, Mary responded with measured clarity, redirecting the conversation without offense, yet leaving no room for further disrespect. Adrian felt a sharp, unexpected reaction, not of irritation, but of something closer to protectiveness, though he could not justify it within the limits of their agreement. He dismissed the feeling quickly, reminding himself that her actions required no intervention, yet the sensation lingered longer than he preferred. Later that night, as the estate quieted, Adrian found himself reflecting on the evening with an unusual restlessness. He recalled the ease with which Mary had navigated the gathering, the subtle strength beneath her calm demeanor, and the way others had begun to recognize her not merely as his contractual wife, but as a presence of significance in her own right. This realization unsettled him, not because it threatened his authority, but because it challenged the simplicity of the arrangement he had insisted upon. Mary, however, remained unchanged in her approach. She neither referenced the evening nor sought acknowledgement for her conduct, continuing her routine with the same steady composure. If she noticed any shift in Adrian's behavior, she gave no indication, maintaining the careful distance that had defined their relationship from the beginning. One afternoon, Adrian encountered her in the garden, where she stood observing the quiet movement of the grounds, her expression thoughtful but untroubled. He paused, uncertain of his purpose, yet unwilling to simply walk past. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching between them in a way that felt neither uncomfortable nor familiar. "You seem at ease here," he said finally, his voice carrying a hint of something less guarded than usual. Mary turned slightly, meeting his gaze with calm clarity. "It is a peaceful place," she replied, her words simple yet deliberate. He considered her response, sensing that it carried more meaning than it revealed, yet he did not press further. Instead, he found himself standing beside her longer than necessary, aware of the quiet presence she maintained without effort. It was then that he recognized a subtle shift within himself, not fully formed, yet impossible to ignore. For the first time, Adrian felt the faint intrusion of something beyond control, something that did not align with the boundaries he had established. He dismissed it outwardly, returning to his responsibilities with renewed focus. Yet the certainty he once relied upon no longer felt absolute. And though he refused to acknowledge it, the distance he had so carefully preserved was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to fracture. Time, once measured with precision and indifference, began to carry a weight Adrian could no longer ignore. The contract that had once seemed distant in its conclusion now approached with quiet certainty, each passing day narrowing the space he had taken for granted. Though nothing in their arrangement had outwardly changed, the awareness of its impending end unsettled him in ways he refused to name. Mary remained consistent, her composure unshaken by the passing months, her presence as steady as it had been from the beginning. She fulfilled every expectation without fault, managing the estate with quiet efficiency, maintaining the balance she had carefully established, and never once stepping beyond the boundaries he had defined. If the approaching end of their agreement affected her, she gave no visible sign, and that absence of reaction stirred a growing unease within him. Adrian found himself watching her more often, though he would have denied it without hesitation. He noticed the way she moved through the halls with purpose, how she spoke with measured clarity, and how she remained entirely self-contained, as though she required nothing from the life she occupied. What unsettled him most was not her independence, but the realization that she seemed entirely prepared to leave it behind. He began, almost unconsciously, to alter his behavior in subtle ways that contradicted his earlier detachment. Conversations that once ended quickly now lingered. Questions extended beyond necessity, and his presence appeared in places where it had never been required before. Yet each attempt to close the distance was met not with resistance, but with the same calm neutrality she had always maintained, as though she neither encouraged nor rejected the change. One evening, during a quiet meal, Adrian set aside his glass and regarded her with a focus that carried more intent than usual. "The contract will conclude soon," he said, his tone controlled, though the statement felt heavier than he intended. Mary nodded slightly, acknowledging the fact without hesitation. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, her voice even, her expression composed. He waited, expecting something more, a question, a suggestion, perhaps even a trace of reluctance, but none came. The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of irritation that had no clear source. "You have made no mention of your plans," he continued, his words measured, though edged with something sharper. "There is little to discuss," she answered. The terms were clear from the beginning. Her response was neither dismissive nor cold, yet it carried a finality that unsettled him more than defiance ever could. He studied her, searching for any indication that she might hesitate, that she might consider remaining, yet her calm demeanor offered no such reassurance. In the days that followed, Adrian found himself increasingly restless, his thoughts returning to the same unspoken question he could not bring himself to ask. He tested the boundaries in ways that felt unfamiliar, offering small invitations to shared moments, extending conversations beyond necessity, and observing her reactions with a focus he could no longer disguise as casual. Mary accepted these moments with the same quiet grace she had always shown, yet she did not misinterpret them. To her, his behavior appeared as a refinement of courtesy, perhaps even a softening of his earlier severity, but nothing that altered the nature of their agreement. She remained careful, maintaining the distance that had defined their relationship, not out of obligation, but out of respect for what had been clearly established. As the final weeks approached, preparations began without announcement. Documents were reviewed, arrangements considered, and though no formal discussion took place, the conclusion of their contract became an unspoken certainty that lingered in every interaction. Adrian became increasingly aware of the subtle signs, the quiet organization of matters that required no attention unless departure was imminent. One afternoon, he entered the study to find Mary seated at the desk, reviewing correspondence with the same calm focus she had always displayed. For a moment, he simply watched her, the familiarity of the scene clashing with the knowledge that it would soon no longer exist. "You are making preparations," he said, his voice quieter than intended. Mary looked up, meeting his gaze with steady composure. "It is only practical," she replied. "I would not wish to leave matters unfinished." Her words were reasonable, yet they struck with unexpected force, reinforcing a reality he had not fully accepted. He stepped further into the room, his usual certainty faltering as he struggled to reconcile the clarity of the situation with the unease that had taken hold of him. "You speak as though there is nothing to reconsider," he said, his tone carrying an edge he did not attempt to conceal. Mary regarded him carefully, as though weighing the meaning behind his words. "There was never anything to reconsider," she answered gently. "That was the understanding from the beginning." The simplicity of her response left no space for argument, yet it revealed a distance he had not anticipated. For the first time, Adrian understood that while he had begun to question the boundaries of their arrangement, she had never done so. The realization settled heavily, bringing with it a clarity that was both undeniable and deeply unsettling. On the final morning, the estate carried an unusual stillness, as though even the walls recognized the shift that was about to occur. Mary moved through the halls with quiet purpose, her actions precise and unhurried, ensuring that everything remained in order. There was no visible sign of hesitation, no indication that she viewed the moment as anything other than the natural conclusion of what had been agreed upon. Adrian encountered her in the entrance hall, where her belongings had been prepared for departure. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching between them with a weight that neither had anticipated. He searched for something to say, something that might alter the course of what was unfolding, yet the words remained out of reach. Mary inclined her head slightly, her expression calm, her voice steady. "Thank you for honoring the agreement," she said. "I wish you well." The formality of her words struck deeper than any accusation could have, reinforcing the distance he had failed to bridge. Before he could respond, she turned, her movement composed, her departure unhurried, and walked toward the waiting carriage without looking back. The door closed with quiet finality, and as the sound echoed through the empty hall, Adrian remained where he stood, the silence around him suddenly vast and unyielding. It was only then, in the absence she left behind, that the truth became impossible to deny. He had mistaken control for certainty, and in doing so, he had lost something he had never allowed himself to understand until it was already gone. Silence settled over the Valmont estate with a permanence Adrian had never anticipated, transforming familiar spaces into hollow reflections of what they had once been. The absence of Mary was not loud or dramatic, yet it pressed against every moment, reshaping the rhythm of his days into something unsteady and incomplete. He continued his duties with outward precision, attending meetings, issuing directives, and maintaining the composure expected of him. But each action felt detached from purpose, as though the structure of his life remained intact, while its meaning had quietly dissolved. He found himself pausing in places he had once passed without thought, noticing details that now carried an unexpected weight. A chair left slightly angled near a window, a ledger organized with careful clarity, a corridor that seemed emptier than it should have been. All of it spoke of her presence in ways he could not dismiss. What unsettled him most was not the loss of convenience or order, but the realization that her absence had altered something within him that could not be restored through routine. Days passed with increasing restlessness, his thoughts returning again and again to the moment she had left without hesitation, without expectation, and without regret. He had anticipated resistance, perhaps even a quiet request to remain, yet she had offered neither, and that absence of demand revealed a truth he had been unwilling to face. She had never belonged to the arrangement in the way he had assumed, and she had never sought to. The clarity of this realization forced him to confront what he had long avoided. His insistence on control had not protected him. It had deprived him of the chance to understand what had been growing in his own life. The boundaries he had established had remained intact, but only because she had respected them completely, never challenging him to see beyond them. In doing so, she had left the decision entirely in his hands, and he had chosen nothing. That understanding settled with a finality that left no room for denial, and for the first time, Adrian allowed himself to acknowledge the truth without restraint. He did not merely miss her presence. He needed it in a way that defied the logic he had relied upon for so long. The realization was neither gradual nor gentle, but sharp and immediate, dismantling the certainty he had once held with unshakable confidence. He did not delay once the truth became clear. The responsibilities that had once defined his priorities were set aside without hesitation, not abandoned, but temporarily relinquished in favor of something he could no longer ignore. He left the estate with a resolve that carried none of his usual calculation, driven instead by a singular purpose that required no further justification. The journey was neither simple nor comfortable, yet he moved forward without pause, guided by the fragments of information he had gathered and the certainty that he would not allow distance to become final. Along the way, his thoughts returned to moments he had once dismissed as insignificant, now understood with a clarity that revealed their true weight. Her quiet patience, her steady presence, the absence of expectation that had defined her actions, all of it formed a pattern he could now recognize as something far more profound than he had allowed himself to see. When he finally found her, it was not in a place of grandeur or recognition, but in a setting that reflected the simplicity she had always carried with her. She stood in the soft light of the afternoon, her posture composed, her expression thoughtful, as though she had already begun to shape a life that required nothing from what she had left behind. For a moment, he remained still, the distance between them filled with everything he had yet to say. Mary turned at the sound of his approach, her gaze settling on him with a quiet steadiness that revealed neither surprise nor discomfort, only a calm awareness of his presence. "You have come a long way, Your Grace," she said, her voice even, her tone unchanged, as though acknowledging nothing more than an expected encounter.
"I did not come as your duke," Adrian replied, his words measured but unguarded, carrying a sincerity he had never allowed before. "I came because I could not remain where you were not." She regarded him carefully, her expression composed, though a subtle shift in her gaze suggested she recognized the difference in his tone. "The agreement has ended," she said gently. "There is no obligation that requires your presence here." "There is no obligation," he agreed, stepping closer, his composure steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. "That is why I am here." The simplicity of his response carried a depth that could not be mistaken, and for the first time, Mary's calm reserve wavered, not breaking, but softening with cautious uncertainty. She did not turn away, yet she did not move closer, holding her position as though waiting for clarity that could not be assumed. I believed that control would protect me, Adrian continued, his voice quiet but unwavering. I believed that distance would ensure nothing could be taken from me without my consent. I was wrong. Mary listened without interruption, her attention focused, her silence allowing his words to carry their full weight without interference. I asked for nothing beyond the terms of a contract, he said, and you honored that completely. You gave me exactly what I demanded, and in doing so, you showed me what I failed to understand. It was never the absence of risk that mattered. It was the absence of choice. He paused briefly, not from uncertainty, but to ensure that what he said next carried no trace of the restraint he had once relied upon. I'm not here to offer another agreement, he said. I am here because I choose you, without condition, without expectation, and without the protection of distance. If you refuse me, I will accept it, but I will not pretend that what we had was ever nothing. The honesty of his words left no room for misinterpretation, and in their wake, the silence that followed felt different from before, not empty, but filled with possibility that required a response. Mary lowered her gaze for a brief moment, as though considering not his position, but her own, weighing the certainty she had built against the sincerity now placed before her. When she looked up again, her expression carried a depth that had always been present, yet now revealed more openly. You speak of choice, she said quietly. Yet choice requires trust, and trust is not given easily when it has never been asked for before. I know, Adrian replied, his voice steady, accepting the weight of her words without resistance. That is why I am asking now, not as your duke, but as a man who has finally understood what he stands to lose. The distance between them remained, yet it no longer felt fixed, only waiting. Mary held his gaze, searching for any sign of hesitation, any trace of the detachment he had once carried so easily, but finding none. What remained was not certainty, but sincerity, and it was enough to shift something within her that she had kept firmly in place. I will not return to what we were, she said, her voice calm but resolute. If there is to be anything between us, it must exist without conditions. Adrian inclined his head slightly, not in formality, but in acknowledgement. There will be no conditions, he said. For a moment, neither moved, the weight of what had been and what could be balanced between them, until Mary took a single step forward, closing the distance just enough to change its meaning. It was not a complete answer, but it was not a refusal. And in that quiet decision, something new began to take shape, no longer defined by agreement, but by the possibility of something real.